Bill Gates and Paul Allen founded Microsoft on April 4th, 1975, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, making 2025 Microsoft's 50th anniversary. We at Directions have a unique perspective on this milestone, as a number of the analysts here previously worked at Microsoft. And other Directions staff, such as myself, have kept close tabs on the company for much of its existence. We're going to share some of our ringside seat insights in today's show. Welcome to the 8th episode in a series of Directions on Microsoft podcasts we call Brainstorm. I'm Mary Jo Foley, the editor-in-chief here at Directions, and I'm your host for this series where our analysts discuss emerging topics on Microsoft products, services, and most importantly, strategies. Brainstorm is your chance to look at how the analysts at Directions on Microsoft do what we do. Twice weekly, the analysts hold scope meetings where we talk about the tech news of the week, reports we're working on, and the best ways to deliver the information that our customers need to know. Brainstorm is meant to give you a front row seat into one of these scope meetings. But today's brainstorm is going to be a little bit different. Today, I'm going to ask three of our analysts, Barry Briggs, Michael Cherry, and Rob Sanfilippo, all of whom worked at Microsoft at different and overlapping times, to reminisce about their time at Microsoft and talk about how it shaped their careers as strategic analysts. So let's begin. Some of you panelists worked at Microsoft after a number of other jobs, some of which might have even involved working against Microsoft. You likely all have different early recollections of how you saw the company before you joined. How did your early years at Microsoft live up to what you were or weren't expecting? And I think we should go in order of when you were hired at Microsoft. So I think, Michael Cherry, you go first.
Thanks, Mary Jo. So prior to joining Microsoft in 1990, I was working at a consulting engineering firm called CH2M Hill. And I was working on projects to convert computer-assisted drafting, which was being done on DEC mini computers, to networked PCs. And the leading network software at that time was Novell. I was certified back then on several network operating systems, including 3Com, 3Plus Open, Banyan Vines, Novell NetWare, IBM PC Network. And, just a quick note as an aside, those of you who remember him, Jim Alchin was at Banyan. That's where he kind of started and did a lot of his work on directories. So 3Com and Banyan mostly used a derivative of the Xerox networking system X and S protocols, while the IBM PC network used NetBIOS. Novell used its own IPX protocol. They were privately talking about moving to TCP/IP. And I was doing some early work with AppleTalk. There just weren't that many businesses doing AppleTalk. That was just sort of a retained hobby. Now, at that time, Microsoft did not sell a network operating system per se. Rather, they licensed what was called MSNet to others, including IBM and 3Com.
Okay. So
prior to joining Microsoft, I was only really familiar with two Microsoft products, MS-DOS and Flight Simulator. MS-DOS because all the network operating systems had to load a redirector into DOS's memory. And Flight Simulator because it was used to test the BIOS on the IBM PC clones. Mm-hmm. If a clone could run Flight Simulator without crashing, then you knew the BIOS would be good and it would likely load the redirector. Mm-hmm. But the majority of LANs I built in those days had to run Lotus 123 and WordPerfect. They really didn't have to run Excel or Word, right? The biggies at that time were Lotus and WordPerfect. And most of the local area networks being built were replacements for Wang and a company out of Colorado called NBI. That name stood for nothing but initials. But they both built mini computer-based dedicated word processing systems. So I'd been talking to Novell about their work on TCP/IP when I got a call from Microsoft. And this is really kind of weird because Microsoft called and said they wanted me to leave CH2M Hill and come to work for them, but they wouldn't tell me why they were interested in hiring me. And so my first couple of interviews were just generically, was I interested in Microsoft? And then, I talked to them and told them about my networking, and they'd heard from people that I was like the networking guy.
Nice.
And so then they brought me an NDA. After signing, I learned that they'd been collaborating with 3Com to replace 3 Plus Open with a new product called LAN Manager running on OS2 and using the server messenger block SMB standard for file transfer. And, you know, that's really all. I didn't have much of an impression of Microsoft. And
yeah.
Before becoming an employee, I call my parents and I say, hey, I got an offer from this company called Microsoft, and I think I'm going to take it. And then I had to explain to them who Microsoft was. They'd honestly never heard of it. People with PCs and that might have known it, but it wasn't a household name, and it wasn't a large, wasn't largely invested in. So, I didn't have that much. I didn't have that much knowledge of Microsoft, good or bad, other than, look, all my networking friends told me I was crazy, that Microsoft would never displace Novell in the market. And that just seemed like a challenge that I wanted to be a part of, right? It was either going to be a tremendous failure or we were going to actually do it.
Right.
And, we were starting from way behind everybody else at that point. But was my impression of Microsoft in 1990 when I walked in the door.
Yeah, I remember the early 90s when I was starting to cover Microsoft at PC Week. And I remember we wrote so many articles about Novell versus Microsoft. It was like a constant theme at that point.
And here's the strange thing. I was living in Denver, Colorado at the time, and I was going to be staying in Denver, Colorado for the first part of my my work with Microsoft. But for the first 2 months, I was allowed to tell people that I was employed by Microsoft, but I was not allowed to tell them what my job was. Until I suspect they hadn't told 3Com that they were going to enter the, going to enter the market. So anyways, that's supposition on my part, but that's how I started out.
Interesting. All right. I think next is Rob Sanfilippo, right?
I think so. Yeah. Thanks, Mary Jo. Sort of a little bit similar to that, a little bit different, but I was in college. I graduated in 91. I actually went to the same college as Bill Gates, at least the one that he started at, and Steve Ballmer. But I was there in Cambridge, and, it was late 80s. I graduated in 91, but around that time, Microsoft was gathering momentum, and I was doing computer science, and my roommates were, and we were all really gung-ho hearing about what was going on with this big company behind it all. We loved Excel. That was my favorite app back in the day. I actually used Macs mostly for everything. I started dabbling in PCs in college right around the time Windows 3.0 and 3.1 were coming out. But after graduation, 2 of my roommates went straight to Microsoft from college, but I didn't. I stayed behind in the Boston area for a couple of years working at a software company there. I think right down the street from Barry, actually, and he'll tell you his story too. But I still kept hearing from my friends what great of a time they were having at Microsoft out in Seattle, and what this company was doing, and the whole environment working there. And I after 2 years, I couldn't resist, so I ended up going to Microsoft, traveling west. So I started there in what was on a project called Touchdown in 1993. It was also known as the Enterprise Messaging System, or EMS. That was a product that turned into Exchange Server.
Oh, wow.
So I went, so when I went there, this product, Exchange Server, was actually, the roots of it began in 1990. It turns out, and it was supposed to ship in, I think originally maybe 93, then 94, 95. It ended up shipping in 96, in April of 96 as Exchange 4.0. But after, when I was at the company in Boston before I made it out to Microsoft, I was a developer there. And I was so gung-ho about Microsoft, that was my idol. So all the work I was doing at that company in Boston, I was always trying to mimic what I saw coming out of Microsoft. So I was a developer, and I was creating UIs, I was creating APIs, and I was always trying to do what Microsoft did. And then I thought, well, when I got to Microsoft, there'd probably be a lot of control around doing things in a standard way, so I wouldn't have to be doing any mimicking anymore. Funny thing is, when I got there were very few standards. I actually had to convince people there to make our products more Microsoft-ish at Microsoft.
Nice.
That was a funny thing. So I felt like it was the same thing I was doing at the first company I was at outside of Microsoft. I was still doing it. It's like, hey, we got to be more like Microsoft, even though we are Microsoft. But that was different from what I expected. I thought there would be a little more procedure and control and oversight. But back then, the company had about 14,000 employees. It was still very startup minded. We were inventing our own ways to get things done. There wasn't as much corporate oversight and established process as I would have imagined. So that's the thing that I remember when I first joined.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I remember that. Thinking back to when I was covering the company again, Exchange was like the big kahuna, right? Like everybody was always talking about Exchange, and I feel like a lot of people who ended up in Windows cut their teeth in the Exchange org because it was like the place to basically do the big work, right?
Yeah, it was a big and growing team. Even all the years I was there, we kept growing. I was headed up by Brian Valentine, who moved on to the Windows team after that. So on Exchange, we felt like we wanted to be an OS. We wanted to do everything. We had our own directory, which then turned into Active Directory for Windows Server. So yeah, it was this big, bulky server team. Tough guys. We were the server guys doing what we wanted to do. And if you know Brian Valentine, I think you know what I'm talking about on that.
I do. Yes. Ian McDonald too is another big name I remember.
Yeah, I worked with him all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Very cool. All right, Barry, last but not least.
Yeah, so I remember Exchange in the early days from entirely different contexts and perspective, and you guys know I worked at a company called Lotus Development for a number of years. For the listeners who don't know, it's now part of IBM, but back in those ancient days in the mid-Jurassic period, my job was to write code, and I wrote a lot of the code for Lotus 123 and Lotus Notes, and I have to say, even though I use Excel all the time now, still grimace a little bit and long for the days of the slash key menus. But a couple of memories. At Lotus, we had a kind of a co-opetition relationship with Microsoft. The reality was that 123 and later Lotus Notes pulled a lot of Microsoft OSs. In particular, 123 for the client and Windows Server for Notes, and so Microsoft liked us for those reasons, but we competed as well. And so, we would occasionally meet with their execs from time to time. And I do remember Bill Gates telling me to my face that I was on drugs for wanting to build serious apps in this crazy language called Java. That was Lotus E Suite for anybody who remembers that brief shining moment. Anyway, so I joined Microsoft in August 2003. I was actually recruited, several times before actually being hired. I remember saying to recruiters that I would never, ever uproot my family from Boston, Massachusetts, where my family had lived for generations. I wouldn't, ever. And here I am speaking to you from the sunny Pacific Northwest, sunny in quotes. Anyway, I joined the idea was I joined to lead the integration, get this, SharePoint, BizTalk, host integration server. And the whole idea was to create a whole new product. It was, Mary Jo, you might remember, the code name was Jupyter.
I do remember that.
And the idea was it was intended to compete against this product from SAP called NetWeaver. So here's a lesson I learned. It obviously didn't happen. And the lesson I learned was you can't beat licensing. Licensing trumps everything. BizTalk was licensed by core, right? So the number of cores you had would determine price. SharePoint was licensed by seat, still is, and never the twain of those licensing models shall ever meet. We never could figure it out. So anyway, after a couple of years in server and tools, I left for Microsoft IT. And everybody thought I was crazy. At that time, Microsoft IT was kind of the bastard child of Microsoft. So maybe I was crazy, but, my thought was, after several decades of creating products for IT customers, I wanted to see what it was really like. And holy cow, IT is like way, way harder than product development. And I could go on, and I might just about why. But for the moment, suffice it to say, for the IT folks listening, I get it. I share your pain.
Yes. And I think we have some foreshadowing on how you ended up at Directions, given the licensing point you just made.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
All right, perfect time for me to take a quick break so I can talk about a series of podcasts that we recorded that are specifically about EAs, or enterprise agreements. Here we go again, licensing. Directions created a 6-part podcast series where we featured various members of our advisory services team, which is led by Dean Bedwell, all about Microsoft EA negotiation. Before he joined Directions, Dean spent 11 years at Microsoft managing the Canadian business desk, where he was responsible for negotiating agreements with Microsoft's largest enterprise and public sector customers. In our series, we discuss everything from project management to discovery, analysis, strategies for getting discounts, concessions, and negotiation levers. Whether you're brand new to the EA negotiation process or a veteran who wants to hear more about the tips and the tricks that we've learned over the years, you should check out our Microsoft EA negotiation podcast series. Go to directionsonmicrosoft.com/podcast or visit directionsonmicrosoft.com's YouTube channel, and you can listen to the full series for free. Okay, back to our anniversary brainstorm. This is going to be our freestyle topic. Could go a lot of different directions here. I want to know, what's your favorite memory or story about working at Microsoft? So who wants to go first? Any of you?
Well,
Don't be shy. Come on.
So some of you have heard this story. That might bore the panel here, but I think it's one of my favorite stories. But around Microsoft, myself, another person named Tim Sinclair, and Jeff Zalkind were known as the golf guys. We were all working out of the Microsoft office in Denver, Colorado at the time, and there was a stop on the Professional Golf Association, the PGA Tour, called the International, which was held at the Castle Pines Golf Course south of Denver. Digital Equipment Corp had agreed with the golf course to supply a computer network-based system for the people attending the tournaments so that they would be, and DEC was having trouble just getting it to work. It was supposed to allow people to see what was happening at the tournament and provide them with a bunch of information about, the players and other things. And I can't remember how, but somehow the people at DEC in Denver got in touch with us and asked if we could maybe help them out. And the three of us managed to get the network running throughout the golf course, which was a real issue because they only had twisted pair wires all over the place. We had to debug it and figure out how to get a LAN signal across the twisted pair. And Tim and Jeff wrote an application on SQL Server, and it was really kind of bizarre at its time. It was running on Windows 3, and it had a bitmap of the golf course, and we'd made it into an image map on a web server so that you could walk up to a PC on the course, click on the bitmap, any place on the bitmap, and you could see which players were on that hole and what their score was. And the public just fell in love with this because they could see where the golfers were waiting to tee off, and they could go and get autographs and stuff like that.
Nice.
So this became incredibly popular. We didn't know it at the time, but so it happened that the dates of the tournament coincided with the dates of a Microsoft meeting that was being held in New Orleans, so that none of us from Microsoft who had built the system would be available in Denver. So we got a person from the LAN manager and SQL Server support team in Las Colinas, Texas, to come up to be the one Microsoft person on site. And when we got to New Orleans, everyone was warned. Everyone was warned that while we were in New Orleans, we were not to skip any of the sessions, right? We weren't supposed to be out on the town or doing stuff. This was a working meeting, not a party. And we're sitting in the first session. It was somebody's keynote. It might even have been Bill Gates's keynote, but the keynote had just gotten underway when my cell phone went off. And to help set the date and the time, my cell phone was one of those large Motorola Bricks.
Yeah.
and of course it means you're pulling it out of a bag and you're holding, obviously you're on the phone. There was no hiding it. There was no texting. And of course, the only reason my phone would ring was there was a problem with the program. So, Tim and Jeff and I were sitting together. I kind of signaled to them, and we tried as discreetly as possible to get up and leave the meeting in the convention center and get to our room at the Sheraton so we could call into the file server and see what was happening. So back in our room, Tim was on a compact computer dialed into the program. Jeff was monitoring the event on TV, and I was standing in the window of the room to get enough cell phone signal to talk to our person on site. Now, we'd written this golf system, and none of us golfed. So on the night that we were actually working on it, and we got to a key point of it, I had to look up scoring for golf in a dictionary. What is a birdie?
Nice.
What is par? And the International uses this really weird Stapleford scoring system, which is even a twist on normal golf. And I'd interpreted it wrong. And so people were scoring everybody was getting like eagles and playing way too good. So we're trying to figure out this. We realize, what they're telling us what the score should be and what we've got. So we're figuring out we have to sort of subtract 2 from everything. So Tim's changing the program, and there's a knock on our door. And really, there was somebody pounding on our door. You would have thought it was a SWAT team. So Jeff opens the door, and there was Ballmer.
Oh, wow.
And Ballmer was ranting about having caught us sneaking out of the meeting and that we were going to make an example of us. And so Tim, who was still working on the keyboard, turned to him and he said, "Please sit down and shut up."
Wow.
So Ballmer sits on the edge of the bed, and he's looking over Tim's shoulder, and he's looking at the TV, and he realizes he could see the score on Tim's computer before it was available on the TV. And so he gets up and he leaves the room. We figured out we were fired, but we got the system fixed before too many people in Denver realized it was broken. And we were trying to decide what to do next when there was a knock at the door, and in strolls Gates and Ballmer, the head of the Denver office, who was our boss, and a bunch of other people, many of whom I never got the name of. We spent the rest of the morning demonstrating the system to a bunch of Microsoft people who kept showing up at the door. Long story short, my stories are never short, but Ballmer decides to cancel the demonstration in his keynote the next morning to demo our system to the meeting attendees.
Wow.
This annoyed the product manager whose product was cut from Ballmer's talk,
I'm sure.
but we spent the rest of the day watching Ballmer rehearse and get a script of what he was going to say. And Mary Jo, I don't know if you ever had a chance to see, but when Ballmer rehearsed, it was a full day of screaming.
I'm sure.
Until he lost his voice. And until he lost his voice, the rehearsal wasn't over.
Right. That's
so
awesome.
During the rehearsals, Jeff realized that we were dead if the phone line to the golf course went down while Ballmer was speaking. And so with each rehearsal, the time it took him to get to our demo lengthened. So we came up with a plan. We went out and we got Jeff dressed in the darkest clothing we had. And so on the day of the keynote, he hid behind the podium. And his hand, if you knew where to look, you could see this hand periodically pressing the shift key to toggle the PC enough to keep the line open.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable.
Thankfully, it worked. The demo was great. But from that time on, Steve would see one of us in the hallway and he would go, "It's the golf guys."
Nice.
And he would tell the story that I just told you to whoever was there, and they would be forced to listen to it as well.
You know, one interesting thing about Ballmer, you guys may already all know this, but when I interviewed him, I asked him something about how did he remember people so well? Because he would like remember you as the golf guy, right? And he'd remember me just like randomly, and other people I'd see him remember. And he said, I look at everyone's shoes, and I have a thing in my head where I connect their shoes to them, and that's how I remember their name. And I was like, oh, okay, weird, but sure.
That is weird. What if you change your shoes? How does he
I
know who
know,
you
that's
are?
what I was thinking. I'm like, what if I wore a different pair of shoes though? Anyway, that's a good story, Michael. I like that one. Rob Sanfilippo, you must have some good stories.
I probably do, and I was brainstorming, trying to come up with some good ones. It's going to be tough to follow up on Michael's. That's
I
a great
know it will
story,
be.
and
Right.
I've heard it before, and I love that story.
It's
But
such a great story. Yeah.
I was just thinking, I was at Microsoft 14 years. When I think back to it, I always think of it in epics. So there was like the Exchange epic for me, and then I worked on Commerce Server, and then I ended up working on BizTalk from there. Sort of overlapped with Barry for a time there.
Mhm.
And then I worked on Speech Server, and in the end, I worked on Xbox for a couple of years, which was totally different.
Wow.
So I was thinking back through all my memories. Generally, I think about like the company meetings, especially in the beginning. They got kind of watered down and overdone towards the later years. But when I started working there, we had great meetings in the baseball stadium in downtown Seattle. They would bus us out there for a day, and it was a pretty extravagant thing and a lot of exciting, fun demonstrations. Then we had these company picnics every year at Mount Si, which is up north out in the middle of nowhere. And, it was originally it was the whole company could go out there until it got too big, but they just had all kinds of food and all kinds of fun stuff to do on a Sunday. And you get all baked and burned out there, but that was a good time. Then I was thinking, in 2001, we had an earthquake in Seattle. And I was at work at Microsoft at the time. And so all of a sudden everything starts shaking.
Wow.
And, no one really knew what to do. But someone said, oh, we got to go outside. We were on the third floor. So we're going down the stairs. We go outside. It's totally the wrong thing to do, by the way, when you're in an earthquake. You're not supposed to run outside.
No.
But we did it. And we were standing outside. And remember looking back at the building, like, that earthquake went on for like a minute or so, which is a long time when the earth is shaking underneath you.
Yes.
And we're all like, what's going to happen here? And I remember looking back at the building, a big brick, just a few-year-old building, and you could actually see the bricks rippling a little bit. And I was like, wow, is that it? And then it just stopped and everything was fine. We went back to work. So that was an interesting thing. But then, as far as the work there, I remember all the various launches. So, of course, the launch I was involved with that was big was Exchange 4.0, which that was the first version. It was 4.0, but it was following up on Microsoft Mail, which was version 3. That was a shared file system. And Exchange was client server, of course, so it went from 3 to 4. And that was in April 96. And like I said earlier, it was delayed and delayed and delayed. So it was pretty amazing when we finally shipped a product. And that was the first thing I shipped there. Then, I wasn't part of the team, but the whole company celebrated when Windows 95 released in August of 95. And then I'm a big gamer. And like I said, I worked on Xbox for a while. So when Xbox shipped in November of 2001, that was pretty exciting for me personally and for a lot of people. Other things I remember is just like I was saying, the Exchange team, it was crazy. It was crass. It was prudish. So you never knew what you were going to get out of that team. Sometimes I was afraid of my own team. Is like, what are these guys going to do next? So I have a lot of memories around that. But generally, just thinking about the experience of being able to invent things that would in some way affect millions of people, even if it was like some obscure UI dialogue that I would design, I'd be like, this is going to be the dialogue that, hundreds or thousands of administrators have to look at, or I would name services, or even just come up with the wording for event logs. And it's like, I did that. I'm the one that did that. In fact, if any of you remember the message you would get when your Exchange mailbox is full and it tells you can no longer send mail, check your deleted items folder and delete that too. I wrote that message. So I'm pretty excited about that. But there were bigger things too. Like you get to design how services work and how they communicate, how they store and retrieve data, how they perform. So it was really a great feeling going to work every day, knowing I would have that kind of impact and that anything was possible on any day. It's like that whole change the world thing. It's kind of corny, but it is kind of true when you're working at Microsoft.
That's true. It's true. All right, I'm gonna jump in and tell a quick story before Barry goes, because now you guys are getting me all revved up about fun stories about being part of the Microsoft world. And Rob, you just triggered a couple of memories for me
Okay.
because you're talking about company meetings. So as a reporter, the biggest thing you'd ever want to do is infiltrate a company meeting, right? Like if you could get in there and like hear what they're talking about and get some live footage or whatever, it'd be amazing. I never did, by the way, but I did one time accidentally get into one of the Microsoft buildings unescorted. So that was a big no-no, right? Reporters were supposed to always be escorted at all times when you went to any Microsoft building so that you couldn't run amok in the building. And when I lived in Seattle in the early 90s, I used to go to campus a lot for briefings. Instead of phone briefings, they'd say, come over, you can get briefed on campus. So I go over there so many times to the Windows buildings that people started recognizing me and knowing me. And one day I was over on campus and I was going from one building to the other building because I had two different meetings. And I got to the front desk of the Windows building, and the secretary who was working at the time, she said, "Oh, hi," and she buzzed me in because she thought I worked at Microsoft because she had seen me so much. And I just walked in. And then I'm inside by myself and I'm like, oh boy, I probably shouldn't be here, right? This is bad. But also, I'm intrigued. So I started running around in the Windows building by myself, darting from place to place. And then I finally ended up in front of Jim Alchin's office. And I saw the name on the door and I'm like, is he in there? And I looked in and he was not in there. And so, of course, my heart is racing. I'm like, I should go in there and see what I can see and look around on his desk. And I'm like looking behind me, looking in, looking back, looking in. And I'm like, no, I can't do this. I'm going to get arrested if they see me in here. So I ran down the hall, went into the ladies' room, and then I made my way out of the building through one of the side exits. And I was like, okay, I was really a chicken about this whole thing, but I just got panicked about getting arrested. And a week later, I was back to the building for another briefing, and the woman was about to buzz me in again. And I said, by the way, I don't work here. And she's like, what do you mean you don't work here? And I said, I'm here a lot, but I'm a reporter, and you can't just buzz me in. And she said, I buzzed you in last week. I said, I know. And she said, please don't tell anyone. I'm going to get fired if you tell anyone I let a reporter in the building. I said, I won't tell anyone. So that's my story.
It's pretty good. Tales of espionage.
Yes.
You'd make a lousy spy, Mary Jo.
I would. I just freaked out when I finally get right up to his office. I'm like, oh, I
would.
want to go in there. I looked at the whiteboard. I'm like, oh, and then I'm like, no, I can't do this. I'm definitely gonna go to jail. Anyway, Barry, I'm sure you have many bigger and better stories than that.
I don't know about that, but I was in Microsoft IT for a number of years, and my last role there was as a CTO for the organization, and in that role, I did a lot of public speaking. A lot of which was, what it's like to do IT at Microsoft, and I also did literally hundreds of EBCs, and I did some of the executive tours, and one of my favorites of all of these was in South Africa, actually, in 2008. And I was there for a tech head to give the opening keynote, and there I talked about the virtues of virtualization. See what I did there? Virtues of virtualization. Anyway, on the schedule was that on Tuesday there was tech ed, and the partner conference was on Thursday. So to do on Wednesday with this enormous conference hall in Durban that they'd rented out. So anyway, at the last minute, the folks in charge decided to bring in kids from the local area to hear us Microsoft people talk. So they filled this auditorium, probably like 3,000 or 4,000, with high schoolers and junior high schoolers from the surrounding townships. And I should say, remember, this is 2008. This is like very shortly after the end of apartheid. Anyway, so I got up and spoke for a little while, mostly on technical things. And then one of the teachers stood up and asked, simple question, what's it like to work at Microsoft? How do you answer that kind of question? Anyway, so I thought about it for a second, and then I told everyone about these posters that were up on the walls in the corridors back in Redmond, and it said, and I think, Michael and Rob remember these, it said, change the world or go home. That was what the poster said. And when I said that, there was just this audible gasp from this crowd of junior high schoolers and high schoolers. And so anyway, I finished my remarks, and afterwards the teacher came up to the podium, and we chatted for a few minutes, and I asked, what was that gasp all about, And he said, Barry, they've never heard anybody talk like that before. You've let them know that there are people in this world that think like that think that they can change the world. And then he pointed back to all the kids. He says, maybe now that they know, they can too. That was a really nice moment.
Definitely. Very nice. Okay, on that very nice note, I'm going to take another break before we go to the final topic for the podcast. So I want to talk a bit more about our Directions on Microsoft YouTube channel, where we're posting our podcasts. We also just recently added a couple of new videos there that you will not want to miss. Directions analyst Rob Horowitz has kicked off a new Microsoft Licensing Basics series on our channel, and his first episode, which is called Units of Measure, is designed to help you learn how Microsoft charges customers for its products and services. Rob covers everything from per user and per device licenses and concerns, with capacity and consumption licenses and gotchas also covered in this particular episode. And then we have a new great explainer video about Microsoft's AI strategy from Barry. Barry covers everything from processors, copilots, and agents to RAG apps, models, AI development and management tools, and more in his hour-long video. So make sure you don't miss any of our new content there by subscribing today to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@directionsonmicrosoft. All right, topic 3, our last topic for our episode. If Microsoft 1.0 was Bill Gates, 2.0 is Steve Ballmer's Microsoft, and 3.0 is Satya Nadella's, I'd like you to compare and contrast the version of Microsoft you worked at with today's version 3.0. All right, who wants to start there?
Well, I'll go.
I was going to say we established an order of Michael and me and Barry. So.
Okay, go ahead.
That's true.
Go ahead, Barry. Though it doesn't.
Oh well, I was going to start and just say, having been in this industry for a long time, one thing I've learned is that I think that the CEO really does imprint his personality or her personality and psychology and attitudes on a company. I think about Bill. Bill's Microsoft was, and Michael and Rob, you can say more about this, but I think it was like a startup, and he micromanaged it like any startup CEO. My impression of Bill was that he's a person who likes hard problems, and he likes people who can solve hard problems. Contrast that, like somebody like Steve Jobs, who wanted people who can build the really cool thing that he wanted, like the iPhone, in which he knew would sell. When Bill transitioned it to Steve, Steve is a businessman, and a lot of people underestimated him, but Steve transformed Microsoft from a consumer company to an enterprise company. He hired a professional sales force. He established metrics and measured their performance. He started the annual CEO and CIO forums that Microsoft hosts, where he and other execs listened to what our customers actually said. Mm-hmm. By the same token, on the other hand, Steve, at least my impression is, he didn't command the respect and admiration, even worship among the technical staff that Bill did. And I said this in my video on AI, actually, that Satya is the philosopher king of tech. Better than anyone, I think he expresses a vision of what the next AI-powered generation of software is and do. And I think in some ways he's transformed Microsoft back to its startup / high growth mode. But, we'll have to see if he can manage the business as well if it slows. Mm-hmm. And he has to start watching the numbers like Steve did.
True.
That's my view.
Yep. Good. I like it. Rob?
Sure. Okay. Well, Barry and I did not compare notes, but I almost had the same things to say.
Oh, well.
So I guess we think alike on this, and we know Microsoft, I guess. So I was there during the 1.0 and the 2.0. I wasn't there for the 3.0, but 1.0 with Bill had that startup feeling. It felt like the tech was king. Regardless of your title, you were engineer minded if you worked at Microsoft. And we all know Bill wrote the original code that got the company started, but he continued to get into code for the next couple of decades, even though he had to run the business. So just like Barry said, it was this very technical, very engineering, problem-solving kind of company. And then you go to 2.0 with Steve. That was after the massive initial growth of the company. So it was this pretty much probably had the biggest market cap of any company at that point. And there was bureaucracy, there were marketing heavy initiatives, and there were legal woes. So all these things were riding on the company now, and it wasn't as much of a hero as it had been in the first couple decades. There had been flubs like Bob and Windows ME, and it just wasn't as flawless as it had been. And there were missed opportunities like mobile and social media. And even though the company never contracted, it was always growing. It was always on that upward trend. It was going through a recovery period, which eventually ushered in that version 3.0. And hey, version 3.0, that's when Microsoft finally gets it right? So with the 3.0 version that the company's in now, we've seen this tremendous success with cloud services and a lot of reasons to believe Microsoft is going to have a solid future with AI. But I'm as optimistic as I've ever been about where the company is headed now.
Okay. Michael.
So most of my time at Microsoft was during Microsoft 1.0, like more than 90% of my time. When I joined, there were about 3,000 people who were employees of Microsoft. When I joined, many of those employees had never worked anywhere else. An overwhelming number of them had been hired right out of university. I was one of the first hired with on-the-job work experience. And when I left, there were about 50,000 people. And I thought that was way too many people. And mostly because what I call the prior norms of Microsoft 1.0 were breaking down. Microsoft 1.0 saw a lot of risk taking. And I don't just mean risk taking by management. I mean individual employees were taking risks. We were doing things that many people felt couldn't be done. We were doing things we didn't have the authority or the power to do. And as Rob indicated, you get on a team and you think there'll be a procedure manual or there'll be some processes in place. And it was like, no, you were making them up as you went. And often you got work done by trading favors. If someone, even in another part of the company, asked you to do something or to help them and you did, then there was this expectation that you could ask them for a favor in return and they would have to honor the request. It was a system of quid pro quo. There were no reserved meeting rooms or executive shuttles. The organization was remarkably flat. The key person on most teams was a great admin, a person capable of removing the barriers so that other people could get their work done. Knowing what rules could be bent. But before I left, the transition from Gates to Ballmer, there was a growing hierarchy and more managers of managers. And I think one of the things that points this out, you'll always have these missives from management. And if you're outside of Microsoft, it's always fun when GeekWire finally publishes the full memo or the email. But to me, they were different in tone during the 1.0 era than they are today. I think this is best demonstrated by the Shrimp and Weenies memo of 1993 that Mike Murray wrote. And this memo kind of told us that we were getting extravagant and we were kind of getting too big for our britches, and that we needed to avoid unnecessary extravagance and spending. But there was a feeling that this applied to everyone equally. We were all in it together. But the management bloat just kept creeping in. I think that might be the case today with Microsoft 3.0. I'm not saying there was no management bloat in Microsoft 2.0, but I think they were no longer the nimble player getting the most out of the talented developers and program managers. And just as an example, Barry mentioned licensing, and that's a key point. for most of Microsoft 1.0, a license fit on a card that could fit into a product box on front and back of one page. That was the complete terms of use. And activation creeped in towards the end because Gates was always concerned about privacy. But look at the bloat now. You know, if you take the Windows 3.0 license and compare it to the Windows 11 license, that shows that there's just too many cooks stirring the broth. Anyway, that's how I see it. Yeah. I'm hopeful for 3.0. I think the company's still going to go on and do great things for a long time. But I think it just doesn't have that, and maybe you can't have that feel of being the plucky startup beyond the 1.0, you know, somewhere around a 10 to 20 year span.
Right. I remember when I was I've covered Microsoft in all three phases, but when I was covering them during the Ballmer years, people would say to me, "Why are you still covering Microsoft? Aren't you bored covering Microsoft? It seems like they're kind of like on the downturn. They're on the wane. They used to be great. Now they're not that great." But I said, you never will be bored covering Microsoft. They're so unpredictable. They're in every market. They're always doing, you think you've got them figured out, and then they do something completely opposite of what you thought they were going to do. And I think during the 3.0 era that we're in now, it's even more apparent that maybe it's just they're making it up as they go along, or maybe they're just trying to stay ahead of the curve. But I think they've gotten exciting to outsiders again, and I think it's really lucky that all of us get to be part of it. And
they're a first mover now.
They are.
First time that I can remember.
It's
right?
true.
I mean, you know, Exchange followed Lotus Notes. Sorry, Rob. And Windows followed Mac, and so on and so on. So, you know, and they were always very good at being that fast follower, but now they're first movers. So it's an interesting and different time for them.
It is. And for us watching them and covering them. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. That was really fun. And I want to give a special shout out here to Michael Cherry, as this is his last Brainstorm podcast as a Directions employee. He is retiring next month. Say it isn't so, Michael, but I know it's time. Michael has been an analyst at Directions for 25 years after working more than 10 years at Microsoft. And I have known him for more than a decade, maybe even two. I've quoted him many times in my years as a Microsoft reporter, and he's been one of the leaders of this analyst firm. He's always ready with key observations on privacy, as you just heard him mention, security, legal ramifications of products and strategies, all of those kinds of things. We know he's going to continue to be a loyal listener and reader of our content. And I just want to say happy retirement, Michael Cherry.
Thank you, Mary Jo. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All right. And I would also like to remind our listeners that they can find more coverage of all things Microsoft related on directionsonmicrosoft.com. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have questions, comments, or any topics that you would like to hear the Directions analysts cover in one of these podcasts, please do not hesitate to contact me via X or Blue Sky. We at Directions have converged our existing social media channels into a single platform, so give us a follow at Directions MSFT on X or Directions on Microsoft on Blue Sky for all of the latest Microsoft Enterprise product and licensing information. Thanks again.